Hi folks, welcome to Recently Seen Reading. I'm Heather and I have a quick, I hope as always, summary of the reading I've done in the last week and a bit. A good start to a new year, which is promising. I've got 3 titles to talk about. I wanted to start the new year off by reading something that I ought to have read years and years and years ago. So I picked up W.E. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folks. This is a classic of American literature and a classic of Black American history. My education in Black American history as a high school student or an undergraduate or a graduate student was essentially non-existent. So I've decided to fill some of those gaps over the last couple of years, and Du Bois I should have gotten to earlier. When I picked it up, I was expecting, since I knew he was a sociologist, something slightly academic and simply maybe numbers heavy and tables heavy, kind of in the style of early 20th century sociologists. And I was very, very wrong. It's not a dry academic text at all. It's a very writerly text. It's a collection of essentially, I think, 10, 12 essays. And what should have tipped me off right away if I'd flipped through the book before I decided to read it is that each chapter begins with, a stanza or 2 stanzas of poetry and 5 or 6 bars of musical notation. And that's a very big clue that what I was about to read was not academic in its, at its core. In The Souls of Black Folks, Du Bois is aiming to explain the history and status of Black men and women, primarily Black men, in the United States around the turn of the century. This came out in 1903, I think. And he's trying to explain how Black people got to where they were. Essentially, it's an exploration of the impact of slavery and, more importantly, the impact of failed Reconstruction movements on the fates of many Black people in the United States. And it's a sustained argument and praise for education as a tool and as a necessary step. Du Bois offers a model where the best and brightest should lead those who aren't necessarily the best and the brightest. This is kind of shorthanded usually as the talented 10th. And there's all kinds of complexities and difficulties with that idea, but it's very fundamental to the set of essays he's written. I'm very glad I've read this. I ought to have read it a long time ago. I think it's going to help me understand some of the contemporary African American literature I've been reading a little more quickly. So, for example, last year, The Love Songs of W.E. Du Bois by Fanon Jeffers was making the rounds everywhere, a highly praised novel, which I didn't actually like very much. I think in some ways it's a very flawed novel. But having read Du Bois, I have a much better understanding now of what she was trying to do. Similarly, reading Du Bois is giving me a better sense of what the strengths of Caitlin Greenidge's Liberté, a novel that came out last year but I didn't see talked about much, what the strengths of her projects were and what she was trying to do in her novel. And I think it's actually a more successful novel than the far more praised Jeffers novel. So very much recommend reading Du Bois. Some of his ideas, I think, have been replaced in lots of useful ways, but understanding his project, I think, will enrich my reading of African American literature, both fiction and nonfiction, going forward. So a very useful first book of 2023 for me. The second book I picked up was a novel by one of Du Bois's contemporaries, E.M. Forster. So I've read Where Angels Fear to Tread, which came out in 1905. I'm not going to say much about it. I picked this up as part of Jen the Librarian's Forster read-along, which she's running this year. I found this a quick, pleasant, easy read. The copy I found on Google Docs is deceptively long looking in terms of page count, but small pages, large font, so it makes it a quick read. And it's a story about unpleasant British people and some unpleasant people in Italy coming together and clashing, and good things and many bad things happen. The third book I want to talk about that I've read in this early part of January is something I've just finished. This is Muriel, Rukeyser's novel, The Savage Coast. Savage Coast? Yeah, Savage Coast. This one. Now this was published in 2013 based on her 1936 experiences at the very, very beginning of the Spanish Civil War. And it's a book that she didn't actually publish during her living. She tried to get it published in 1937, 38, and worked on it through much of her remaining life, but wasn't able to get it published. It tells the story of Helen, who's very much a stand-in for Muriel, and her experiences in the first 5 or 6 days of the Civil War in Spain. She's been traveling south from France on a train with a lot of other tourists and athletes who are all going to the People's Olympiad in Barcelona. This was an athletic event set up as an anti-fascist opposition to the fascist Olympic Games about to take place in Berlin in August of 36. And their train stops just outside of Barcelona. There's war has broken out. There's also a general strike and a lot of chaos. And it's an odd novel. It's weak in parts, I think, largely because I don't think she really got to finish it and digest it. It requires that you already understand a fair amount, I think, about the Spanish Civil War and the competing forces in that event and what was going to happen over the next 2.5 or 3 years. You know, the rise of the fascists in Spain, their support by Mussolini and Hitler, the rise of the international brigades coming to fight in Spain, and the outcome of that war, the installation of the fascist Franco government. So all of it's told in Savage Coast from Helen's point of view, but the character's represented as being 22, 23, she doesn't explain the political context or the historical context. It's all very close to her point of view, and that makes it a little bit challenging in points to read. And it's also not a very standard linear novel. It's got documentary elements, it's got poetry, it's got a slightly stream of consciousness. It's a very interestingly odd novel. I think if you're interested in the Spanish Civil War, or you've read bits and pieces or lots of other, the more commonly known works about the Spanish Civil War, you might like this one, but don't go into it expecting a novel that explains the historical context or that fills in gaps. It will show you what the main character Helen sees and understands, and it'll show you the kind of chaos around this group of people essentially stuck on a train and how they get off the train and find housing and how they're eventually evacuated from Barcelona. It's chronologically, it's a short time span, under a week. It's kind of unsettling in its representation of the way language fails them all in many ways, and the intensity of political feeling and the difficulty of discerning people's political positions, because it's a polyglot community on this train. It's full of tourists and newspaper people and athletes, and not a common language at all. Interesting book, flawed, but interesting. So if that sounds like something you might like, you can probably pick it up from a public library. It's a Feminist Press book, came out in 2013. It's probably on the stacks somewhere, or maybe in the secondhand markets. That's my reading for the last week. I've got a bunch of things stacked up for the week to come. I'm on a little bit of a self-imposed no-borrow. I get more than 90% of my reading from one library or another, but I'm also slowly buying, not as much as most people buy, but I've been buying and accumulating and not necessarily reading. So I put myself on a 1 to 3 months no-borrow plan. I have to read what I've already borrowed. I get term loans, so I can have a book for 6 months to a year if I'm not careful, and have it unread on my shelf. So I'm going to try to read down what I've already got borrowed, what I already own, and limit myself to a very small number of newly borrowed books. But for this week coming up, I think what I'm going to try to get through is Ezekiel Mphahlele's Down Second Avenue. It's published in 1951. It's not a biography about his life in South Africa. This is something that I first heard about in the early 1980s when I was taking a course on what was then called Commonwealth Literature, and it focused on South African works. And we didn't get to that one. I also want to try and pick up Kathy Acker's Blood and Guts in high school. I don't know that it's something I'm going to like, but I was aware of Acker in the 80s but didn't pay very much attention to her work. And finally, I'm planning to pick up another Beryl Bainbridge. I didn't get through my entire project last year of rereading all of her works, so I'm going to pick up Bottle Factory Outing, which I remember as being grimly comic, but definitely, as most Bainbridge is, grim. Thanks for watching. I hope you have had a good week and that good things come to you in the next week. Bye-bye.